Then the second
here, but he's also been described as an honorary neurologist.
That's the highest honor you can have, and a speech therapist as well. So that's great. So thank you very much. It's delightful to be a part of the symposium. My talk today is mainly one that I was sort of hoping to sort of generate some discussion amongst us. So everyone so far has been talking about sort of behavioral assessments and how to do them and how to do them better. And of course, that's the lifeblood of what we do as neuropsychologists. But we live in interesting sort of new world with lots of other things in our that we could be thinking about adding to our toolkit. And I'm sort of wondering whether we're being a little bit slow on the uptake. And also, if we are going to do this, how should we do it? I'm not going to give you the answer to how I do it, but I'm just going to hopefully just get us to start talking about it. So, of course, classically, we need to do sort of at least two things as a neuropsychologist. We need to be experts at measuring behavior in patients, which is an art form that requires special skill. And when we come to talking about fMRI, I think some of those skills are needed if we are going to do fMRI sensibly with patients. So there's some art. It's not just you can't throw the same thing as you do with healthy subjects, the patients. So there's, you know, we're skilled to be doing this as neuropsychologists. Classically, of course, all we ever had for a long time was you wait for somebody to actually die and then you may look at their brain. Then, you know, maybe 40 or so years ago, in terms of the technology, structural scanning came along. Those of you a little bit older, it's not that long ago that we didn't really often have the scans for our patients. So when I started in this funny business, we didn't regularly have scans. Even though they, of course, it existed as a technology, it wasn't a planned thing you had, you know, in every clinic. Then along comes both functional PET. Are you even going to see some of this? And fMRI. And my sense is that we don't use that really as much. Of course, there's a huge amount of it done with healthy subjects. We're overwhelmed by it. And some of us feel sometimes we're being pushed out a little bit in neuropsychology because the amount there is in the literature. But its use for what we do, both for theory and clinic, is less. I mean, there's some obviously exceptions that I'll mention that as I go along. I'm going to focus on fMRI because somehow I think intrinsically we want to know about the brain doing cognitive, language, behavioral things. So it's sort of inherently baked into functional fMRI, task functional fMRI. There's obviously lots of other now, many amazing things we can do with neuroimaging. We can do MRS to try and measure neurotransmitters. We can measure connectivity. We can do very clever ligand studies and measure pathology, even try and get pathology out and measure it going out with, I see the amyloid going out. That's all fantastic. I also think they're a great opportunity for neuropsychology. I'm not going to talk about them today because it's far too much to talk about. I'm going to focus on fMRI because of what I just said. It's like inherent. It's almost like the heart of what we are as neuropsychologists. We want to measure the behavior and understand its relationship with the brain. And we can do that with the lesion, but we also might want to know about the rest of the brain that's left over. So there's some opportunities. I'm going to do three sort of opportunities, really. So the first is checking in and beyond the actual structural lesion. So we might want to know, okay, in this piece of brain that seems to be, that's now missing, that's causing the impairment in my patient, what does that brain actually do in a healthy subject? So fMRI in healthy subjects is actually relevant to us. In the old days, in Tim Challice's beautiful textbook, we used to call this the assumption of transparency. So is the lesion really the thing that was supporting the function in the first place? We sort of assume that that's true in basic neuropsychology, but it might not be. But with fMRI, we can go and have a look. It could be that the structural lesions, of course, structural lesions don't perfectly align with functions. There's, you know, a vascular stroke will take out a certain brain area. Some of that will cover the functions of interest, but it'll cover other functions. So there's not a kind of perfect alignment. If you have fMRI data, you can start trying to work out those sorts of questions. This is where we're going to start getting some extra information. The patients have a lot of brain left over, hopefully. What on earth is the rest of their brain up to? You can't answer that from the lesion itself. You've got to go and measure it doing things, and preferably doing things that are task relevant. And so we can have a look at Are the functions still in similar areas as before? Is there functional redistribution? All these kinds of things. And are the undamaged regions still task functional? So it could be that they've sort of shifted around. Is there reduced activation in remaining brain areas? So it's actually that there's a functional lesion as well as the structural. So diasthesis of some form. Do they still respond in the same way, task-related parameters? And if we start doing decoding, are there representations in there, and have they shifted around? And these are kind of exciting things. I think in general, it'd be reasonable to say that it's not being used very much. I think the obvious counterexample is in neurosurgery, where it's now quite common for pre-surgical patients to be doing task fMRI as well as structure and what have you. But they're in a kind of like, I think we need to catch up with some theory and like, what is actually the best way of doing these tests to measure function? Of course, they want to know about, prior to giving somebody a lesion, if I take some brain out, am I likely to give the person a deficit or a deficit that might recover? So they want to know the answer to many of the things that we're talking about this morning, because they're just about to go and cause a lesion for, medical reasons. So I'm going to take us back. You might notice I said, and friends. So the first friend is Jenny Crinian. So this is Jenny's study. This is water PET. We're going to go back in time with the late Richard Wise. They're listening to speech over reverse. This is going to be a task that you can see quite a few times. You get the usual brain areas. This is SPM 99. It did exist. This is before you could do rendering. You see temporal lobe on the left, bilateral anterior temporal lobe, pleasingly including the ventral because it's PET. And it's the typical brain areas you get for when you're listening to speech over rotated. That comes out again. Again, that's the normal subjects. She had two subgroups, so patients with front and anterior MCA stroke, so they leave the temporal lobe in. Their remaining temporal lobe basically responds in the same way as before. So the lesion outside leaves the undamaged areas functionally the same. Then she had a group that have got lesions that go into the temporal lobe, and it knocks out the back end because these are sort of posterior MCA strokes. But interestingly, you still get activations coming into the anterior temporal lobe bilaterally. And then Jane Warren followed up with some more analyses and showed that actually the functional connectivity, if they're highly connected to each other, those patients recovered their comprehension better. So it's not just one of them, it's actually them talking to each other in a coupled functional way. Very nice. If we go and look in this anterior temporal lobe area, superior anterior temporal lobe, Jenny showed, and actually came out again in Jane's reanalysis, that the level of activation here correlates with people's performance. So it's an area that turns on in healthy subjects, but the patients, if they can get it to turn on sufficiently, they do well in the actual behavioral task. So it's kind of a nice coupling. If it drops off, even though it's not lesioned, they've got a functional lesion and that drops their performance. None of them have got damage in the anterior temporal lobe because it's not fed by most of those arteries. Here's the second opportunity. So what about, can we use this for understanding resilience and recovery? Well, it would be very nice to know some answers to what are the bases of having a resilient system. So you can damage it but not have deficits. And of course, there's sort of various ideas. There's Kathy and Carl's ideas of degeneracy. So you've got more than one sort of coding or support system pathways for a function, and that we're presumably using a mixture of those ourselves normally. And then if you've got those, it makes you resilient if one of them is damaged, basically. We also cooked up this new word, neurodisplacement, which basically means you're sort of revving up the brain systems that remain. So if you think of a car with a slightly sticky cylinder, if you just rev the car harder, you can still get it to go perfectly well on the motorway. It won't be very good for it in the long term. You can get all the function back, though, just by working the damn thing harder. And in engineering, they talk about how to do displacement. It's called in car engineering. And it's partly to do with saving energy versus the power output of the system. And so the argument would be, we have that intrinsically in our systems, because sometimes things are a bit tricky in everyday life. We need to rev up our systems. Other times it's easy and we can relax them back, save metabolic energy. And so then the idea would be you've got an intrinsic mechanism that if you're now impaired as a patient, you just run it harder. But that's a system we all have. It's not a brand new one. And so, of course, if we go and measure the brain doing tasks, we can have a look at that. And maybe we can see automatic engagement of these other sort of support systems, which may be multi-domain or singular. And maybe we can also see it in the pre-morbid healthy system. There's also longer term recovery. So maybe the brain actually can do some long-term reweighting. Sometimes it's called plasticity, experience-dependent plasticity, otherwise known as learning, where you reweight the pathways and connections through a learning process. And you could then see a change in the division of labor long-term in the systems. And of course, if we were doing fMRI, task fMRI, we can maybe see that shifting through time by going and also maybe measuring representations. So back to another friend. So this is back to Alex. This is one of my all-time favorite papers. So this is also was done with Richard Wise. So this is people listening to speech again, but they're single words, but coming at different speeds. And I think this is an important first ever demonstration that you can see recovery, not because new brain areas turn on, but within the brain area, it's changed its engineering, in effect. So these are just listening. So you see the superior temporal lobes bilaterally, healthy subjects, and underneath is the sort of rate. So it's a parametric, one of the first ever parametric fMRI water PET studies. So as the speech gets faster and faster, these brain areas work harder. And it's true on the left, true on the right, but it's lower. The gradient is lower on the right. And then Alex took a set of patients that have taken out their left STG, did the same analysis, whole brain analysis. It's the same brain area on the right as controls. So if you do patients minus controls, you get nothing. And you say, well, nothing has changed. But if you go and Alex went and looked inside, and it turns out that they've turned the gradient up. So they've re-engineered the function inside the brain area to pick up the ability. So you've sort of tuned it up, sort of its responsivity curves. And I think that was an important demonstration that we need to get inside these brain areas as well as just looking at where they are. Okay, so then the third one is understanding the neurocognitive basis of therapy. So I'm very interested in therapy. And, you know, so sometimes, you know, if we really understood what was going on by measuring the brain actually doing things, we might get a much better idea of enhancing the positive changes you see spontaneously in patients, maybe trying to sort of hold back maladaptive changes in recovery. If we really understood what was going on inherently in recovery, we could sort of like basically hijack that process in therapy. Now, it might be a very powerful therapy because you're just hijacking inherent systems. We could also do reverse translation. So we sometimes know that this is true in drug therapies as well, of course. Behavioral therapies, some of them work for some patients and others, but we don't really know what the mechanisms are. We don't know what's happened to the brain when we give somebody a naming therapy. Well, if we do the naming therapy, but bring it back with some scanning, maybe we could understand what's going on. I guess I forgot to start my timer. Yeah, and also if we could then get into the individual differences in response, we could then do better stratification of the patients. So I just want to just mention here, there's for me a foundational challenge. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to relate brain to behavior. And so really to understand some of these questions about the patients, we need to actually ultimately answer these fundamental questions. Completely non-trivial, but we need to understand what is the relationship of the brain to the cognition. And then we also have to understand the relationship of different measures that we can get out of fMRI, activations, deactivations, neural coding. How does that actually relate to behavior? We sort of sometimes assume they're linearly related, but clearly they're not. And I think we need to get into doing a bit more modeling. We need to have some hypotheses about how those things relate to each other. Okay, so this is very quickly, this is, there's many models we've done. This one I did with Yanning. It's a very simple model that repeats words. It's given phonemes one by one on the input. It has to spit them out on the output, having heard all of them. So it has to buffer them up. It passes it through it has two pathways available to it, a left and a right dorsal pathway. And in the model, we show what happens if you change the balance of the model. I'm choosing the left-sided one, not the most extreme, but the left-sided one. We can damage it in the left after it's been trained, or the right, and see what happens. Here's the model just learning to start with. So it's trained on words, lots of words, high and low frequency. It can generalize it to non-words. So it can repeat a non-word, having trained at the end. Then we damage it. If you damage on the right, there's a little drop. And then with some recovery, which is just relearning, it comes back. So it's transiently mildly aphasic, 50% damage. On the left, collapses, but then recovers up to an asymptotic position. If you look at the final positions dependent on severity, you can see here that this is quite interesting. So in the mild phase, you can damage about 20% of the model and it can completely recover. So it's resilient to some degree, and then it drops off with these final positions. We can look inside. This is what's so useful. You can look inside these models now, though. So this is the performance of 3 levels of damage. That's the behavioral performance. These are the unit activations. So it's our proxy to bold. So you can see it's actually before damage, it's dominant in the left and the right, just like healthy subjects. Then what you can see is it jumps up in activation in response to being damaged. And depending on the level of severity, the left side starts coming down in its final activations, and the right is going up. But it's just, so people have all these ideas about the good recovery is if it's on the left and on the right, and bad if it's on the right. It's all to do with the severity of the damage, according to the model. Okay, but notice that they're not straightforwardly related to the behavioral performance. You know, this is jumping up straight away. One nice thing about this model is nothing happens on the right. This model, when it's very mild, shows an effect that Dorothy showed in one of her famous papers. So you can see early on, the right hemisphere actually jumps up even more than the left, which Dorothy showed in here. So that's here. So you see bilateral, but very strongly right than left. Sorry, and then it relaxes back. It relaxes back more for the right than it does for the left, which is exactly what the model does. So it's only true in the mild window. Do you get this sort of bilateral, and then it sort of sinks back to being left dominant again. For the more severe ones, it stays right-sided. So I think that's quite nice. We can actually have an explanation of that. The other thing that we started doing in this paper was doing decoding, so representational decoding. So we look at the phonological representational coding inside the model. So this RSA, like some of you might know in fMRI, it turns out that when you do this, these left hemisphere units are doing phonological codes. And what you can see is as they're recovering, it actually fits very directly with the behavioral output of the model. So that implies that activation is clearly important. You need a system to be activated, but you actually need to tune the representations. And by doing some decoding, we can start seeing sort of what's going on inside the system. And just to finish, we've had a little go at this in the patients. So this is with Nicholas Weimers, who came from Dorothy's group over to visit in Cambridge. And we had some data that Jamie Stefaniak had collected with AJ and me. So here at activation, they're listening to sentences over rotated speech, controls, patients, the same sort of typical brain areas being activated and deactivated in yellow. The patients do actually activate everything else that the controls do. It's a little bit lower. Statistically, is actually not different. It's just slightly weaker, but we saw more variation in it. Then we did a task decoder on the same data. So which brain areas can you decode listening to speech versus not listening to speech? Now you see loads more brain areas. So it seems like there's some silent brain areas that know something about that you were listening to speech, even areas that are deactivated. So it sets up a little bit like Rahel said in hers, like, oh, you start with a question, you come out with 3. So there's some interesting things to explore about the relationship of task decoding versus the raw activations. But it drops off a bit in the patients. And if you do a statistical difference between controls and patients for the task decoding, we found 4 areas that are less in the patients than the controls. Interestingly, it's not just the patients who got a lesion there. So in these violin plots, the green and the blue are all patients in green, or blue are the patients who preserve that brain area. And so that it shows that even if you've got that brain area intact, they're showing lower decoding. So we're calling this informational diaskesis. And just to finish, I promise I'm finishing. It turns out the model does this as well. So actually we did the imaging after the model. So this is we went back to the same model. It's the same, we didn't change anything. If you look here, these blue lines are the solid are the lesions layer, and the next layer on is never lesioned in this model. And we see drop of decoding in the peri-lesional but remaining units in the damaged part of the model, and people are often interested in peri-regional recovery, but also in connected brain regions that don't have a physical lesion, but they're connected. And so you see this whole system is dropping, and that comes out in the model as well. So on that note, these are just what I've just said. So I think there's an opportunity here. We can get information beyond the lesion. It offers insights potentially to recovering therapy. But I think we need sort of the open science theorizing. So we need formal models of some kind to understand and think about mechanistic things that are going on inside the brain to be able to relate the brain to behaviors and recovery of function in patients. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very nice to hear. We've got time for questions. Please, at the back. Thanks.
Well,
thank you, Matt. That was a fascinating talk, and you make a really good argument for fMRI and some of these more modern tools. I'm also really interested in the model devised by you and Yanning, and I was wondering if you could speak a bit about the thought process underlying your decision to make it as it exists in its like simplified form. I'm guessing, as with anything, there's a sort of trade-off between making it naturalistic and much more complex, and sort of somewhere like, where do you find the balance between that?
So for me, models are a little bit like analyses or experiments. You need to start with what your questions are. And so that model was deliberately simplistic, partly because making really big, like deep learning language models, deep neural network, are very hard to actually make and get to run properly, and a big electricity bill at the end of it. But often, even if you can simulate it, they get so complex you can't really understand anymore what it was doing. And for me, the reason for building these models is to try and have, if they're effectively an implemented hypothesis about what's going on. And it's an open science way of doing it because they're implemented. Somebody else can go and get that and run it. And so we have no hiding places for things we have not simulated or tried to simulate, and things that we are trying to simulate. Because it's smaller, we have, I think, a better chance of then understanding what on earth it was up to. And so things like that informational diaskesis, we went back to the same model and found it. That wasn't something that we were looking for to start with. So they can be powerful even in the unpredicted elements.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Great talk. Thank you. I've got like a bit of a technical question regarding the model again. What kind of stimuli representations do you use?
Yes. So this model uses the same kind of representations used in other PDP models of language and reading. So it's a slot-based phonetic coding of the phoneme. So you effectively have a distributed coding of place, articulation, what have you, voicing for each phoneme, and it goes on. That's the input. So then you do it phoneme by phoneme. And then there's layers. The first layer is got self-connection. So it's called an Lambon network in some of that work. So it's able to buffer up information. And the model it's not allowed to say anything at output before it's heard all the phonemes. Then there's a signal, sort of like a go signal. And so it has to have buffered up the phonemes in the correct order, and then it sort of rolls them out one by one. Turns out that's computationally not actually straightforward to do. And then what's nice about it is it can generalize to non-words. So it can really learn to do the sequential coding of inputs, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Thank you.
Matt,
No,
This will be very quick. So I really enjoyed that, Matt, because it was so thoughtful. But I was wondering, if it isn't informational diaskesis, what other kind of diaskesis is left?
well, I guess there's sort of, in my simplistic mind, so there's sort of diaskesis of you're not sort of perfusing an area remotely, or you're not innovating an area. So like, you know, say some subcortical motivational things, you know, your frontal lobes might look perfectly fine, but unless you're really innovating them, they won't actually be turning on. So if you throw a patient into a PET scanner with FDG, their frontal lobes are not turning on, even though they look like they're there in a PSP patient, let's say. So I think of that as more kind of like the system is just not biologically turning on. Presumably, I mean, we didn't measure perfusion in these brain areas, but I think it's possible to have a version where the brain area could be coming on, but it's not coming on with the right kind of tuned representation. So actually in the model, that's true. So that model shows, if anything, they're more overactive than what they were in the pre-morbid. They're turning on, but the representation they're forming is very poor. So it's a bit like you turn the radio on and you haven't tuned it in. If we have to be pre-digital radios now, you know, it's just pink noise. So yeah, you could, but then there'd be another version where the batteries are just become disconnected from the circuit. And so the actual radio is not actually turning on, if you see what I mean, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you so much. There will be maybe time afterwards for more questions. Thank you so much.